Hello, you're listening to Sending the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher in SENDCO myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I'm really excited to be joined by Gary Aubin. Gary is author of the Lone SENDCO, a handbook of 300, nearly said 3,000, Gary, 300 questions and answers for busy SENDCOs. He works as the Education Endowment Foundation's Associate for SEND, having been their SEND content specialist. In this role, he has spoken to hundreds of school leaders about the evidence base behind high-quality teaching for SEND. Gary led on the SEND provision for a multi-academy trust of 10 primary and secondary schools for several years, and has recently joined the Whole Education, in which he is working to support SEND leaders and SENDCOs working across the country. He writes postgraduate SEND content for the National Institute of Teaching and Real Training. He is a secondary teacher, former primary and secondary SENDCO, and former secondary head of year. Gary also authors the Send Matters UK blog. So as you can hear, he's pretty much an expert. Good morning, how are you?
Oh, I'm fine, thanks, Georgina. That's a very kind introduction. I should preface it with there are thousands and thousands of things I don't know in relation to SEND, and I do my best to shorten that list. But I there are things I know and things I've done, but there's plenty I don't know. Don't worry.
Oh, well, we'll find that out in the podcast, won't we? I'm kidding.
Okay.
So earlier this year, we had a podcast episode on being a SENDCO, and we had Ginny Bootman on, and she was brilliant. She gave some fantastic advice on sort of work-life balance and homeschool relationships for SENDCOs. And after doing we sort of realised it's such a huge role as a SENDCO role, and one podcast isn't enough. It's not sufficient to cover this. And we have so many listeners who are SENDCOs. So this is sort of like our part 2 of SENDCO podcast episodes, if you like. And I'm really keen for this one to be different. So we're going to focus on SENDCO's leading school CPD and effective CPD, what it looks like, receiving CPD, and the new NPQ. There's a lot of acronyms there. And importantly, we're going to mention, just briefly, your brilliant book, which is an absolute staple on my bookshelf. It's an absolute fantastic book, which is the Lone SENDCO. So if we start with the SENDCO role, it sounds like you've done most of everything with this. You've been a primary and a secondary SENDCO. What did you love about the role, and how did you become a SENDCO? Because I always find it really interesting how people become SENDCOs, because it's not always the same way.
Yeah, thanks, Georgina. And just to say, it's a real pleasure to be on the podcast. It's a really great, resource for, and so thank you very much for having me. The SENDCO role, I'd been in a pastoral role as a head of year and then went and taught internationally for a couple of years and came back to be a teacher and loved it. I thought, what's my next thing? I want something else that isn't quite head of year, but didn't quite know what it would be. And then the SENDCO role came up in the school I was working in at the time, and it literally was as sort of fortuitous as that. So I trained as a drama teacher, so I think many pupils with SEND who might struggle, some of them in some of their other lessons actually can really thrive in a practical subject like drama. And so that sort of kinship to kids who need a bit more thought around how they're going to thrive in school, that sort of occurred from the start of my teaching career, really. So when the SENDCO role came up, it felt like a very natural fit. There was a lot to learn all at once, but I love that sort of the pastoral element of it. I actually think the SENDCO role, when it's done too pastorally, ignores the enormous potential of developing teaching and learning as the number one thing we can do to support pupils in school. But I love that sort of that overlap there. And I found that as a head of year, when done badly, the head of year role becomes how long should that detention be for that misdemeanor? And when done really well, the SENDCO role is actually who needs support. And it's not heads of year should be much more than just who's in trouble. But with the SENDCO, it really is the absolute bread and butter of the job is whose day can I make a bit better? So it's that combination of academic and pastoral. It's that coordination of lots of things, isn't it? Lots of adults, every adult in the school potentially, outside agencies, and just brilliant pupils who it's an absolute pleasure to sort of, and a privilege to be involved in the education of.
Oh, that's lovely as well, because we recently recorded an episode with Frances Akinda, and she was saying that the reason she fell into the role of SENCO was because she did art, she taught art, and a lot of students were sort of thriving, like you said, in drama, they were thriving in art, and that's where she sort of realised her strength with them. So that's really interesting, isn't it? How the
I
sort of
think it's, if you get a room full of SENCOs, though, sometimes I say, SENCO, put your hand up if you applied for your role. And, you know, you get a lot of people who have been sort of said, well, you're an assistant head now, and so you need to be the SENCO as well. Or our SENCO's leaving, could you please step in? And then people, you know, either are stuck with it, but more typically fall in love with it and never leave it, or go on to other leadership roles, but never lose the learning and the experience of being a SENCO. So I think, yeah, people come across it in many different ways. And actually, we're in danger of overestimating. You know, it's very tricky when, you know, yesterday you weren't the SENCO and now you are the SENCO, and you're expected to have the knowledge and skills and dispositions to be a really great SENCO. And that's very tricky, and that's asking a lot on someone all at once. So, you know, if you've talked about CPD within this podcast episode, that feels really, really apt to SENCOs who we assume enormous expertise in, and whom it's okay to acknowledge need a lot to learn a lot very quickly.
Yeah, because the SENCO role really is about coordinating the SEND provision, isn't it? It's not necessarily that that person is the beacon of all knowledge on SEND. They might not be at that point at the start of their career.
Yeah, exactly. But they're expected to be sometimes.
Yeah.
And that's a sort of good thing that colleagues are going, I think this child needs something else, so SENCO, can you please help? But actually, we get a bit stuck in magic wand territory. So we get a bit stuck, I think, in the teachers and TAs, colleagues in school, including heads, I think, going, SENCO, this child's, you know, having a bit of crisis. Can you please do something? Or can you solve this problem? Essentially, we get into magic wand, wave your magic wand, and it all will be better. And that, of course, that doesn't appreciate the complexity of children and their needs, and actually that SENCOs don't have magic answers. What they have at best is an intelligent trial and error. So, you know, my best bet is, from something I've read, something that worked for another child, some external advice, is let's try this next and keep reflecting on whether it works or not. But teacher, I, as I said, cannot promise you this is going to work, but this is my best bet, let's try it. And then equally, if we get into magic wand territory, then SENCOs are then going, you know what, I don't know this, but I know someone who will have a magic wand, and that's an educational psychologist. And we refer out to that sort of magic wand, you know, frame of mind, and they don't have one either. So again, it's really important that we don't try and imagine that anyone has the perfect answer for every child, but it's about that, you know, essentially assess, plan, do, review as a lived and breathed culture that we have in all our schools and beyond.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that empowers teachers a bit more as well into realising it's not all down to the SENCO. They too do have some understanding and some knowledge and strategies they can try themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually that much of what they might need to do for a child is about high quality teaching, but it's not just about us saying, as SENCO saying, high quality teaching, off you go, but actually really supporting and developing them to implement that in their practice for a given child. It's difficult though, not trying to say it's easy.
No, absolutely. So when you were first a SENCO, what do you know now that you wish you'd known when you were first started being a SENCO? And I asked Ginny the same question, so it'd be interesting to see the contrast in your answers.
Yeah, okay. I wish I'd been supported more to think about what has impact.
Yeah.
Because I think it's you can always be busy, can't you? You know, the list is never finished. So you always have to make good, judicious choices as to what's going to make the greatest impact on the children and families you're serving. So, and that's things like, it's not, you know, big one-off CPD events. You know, you put it on to like, you know, on Wednesday the 20th of whatever month, I've got an hour. I'm so excited. And actually, it's not big one-off CPD things that's going to develop practice or upskill staff particularly, though it's got a role. Endless forms and getting your paperwork all in a row. I think actually, if I'm trying to make, you know, a child's life in school better tomorrow, it's unlikely that filling in the form is going to be the thing that does that. It might play a part, but actually the impact for work is most likely to be how I support the child, and more impactfully, how I support other adults to support that child. The adults who are with them every day, all day. How can I support them to support that child? And actually, I wish I'd been a bit more reflective when I was a SENCO around, is this thing having the most impact that it can? Yeah. And so again, on impact, it's about, well, if I am thinking about engagement of children in the history curriculum in Key Stage 3, or in their maths lessons in Key Stage 2, whichever, Actually, I can go along and I can, note some things down, tell one kid to sit up a bit, open their book, help them with this and leave. Or I can go in, give a teacher a few strategies and, off we go. And that's great. But actually, if I'm systematically working with whoever leads that area, be it the Key Stage 2 lead or the maths lead in the primary or the head of history in secondary, if I'm systematically and continuously and like in an ongoing capacity working with that adult to lead their provision inclusively, that has far more impact than me just going in and emailing, thanks teacher, please do this and this. That has a role, but ultimately someone else is there to drive outcomes in history. Someone else is there to drive numeracy in primary. And so how am I helping that leader in their role to be inclusive and to think about those pupils as SEND? So I wish I'd focused a bit more on impact. I wish I'd focused a bit more on, I wish I'd remembered that I don't have a magic wand, that for all those issues and challenges that we take home, because we're frustrated things haven't been sort of solved, and I mean sort of speech mark solved, because children aren't problems to be solved, are they? But challenges that I haven't moved forward that day, actually sometimes that is okay, and sometimes things take a bit longer. So I wish I'd thought about impact and a bit more about teaching and learning explicitly, which is what I spend a lot of time talking about now, about how SENDCOs can try and develop a strategy that is about driving teaching and learning for people to SEND, because for me there's no greater controllable factor that we have in schools than how can we support our teachers to be meeting needs in classrooms. Really tricky thing to do. The number one, surely one of the absolute top priorities of a SENDCO.
Yeah, brilliant answer. I love that. So what are your thoughts as well? Because some SENDCOs aren't part of the senior leadership team. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think, especially when you've been describing the importance of their role in teaching and learning and everything and strategic control, across the school, do you think they should be part of the senior leadership team?
Yeah, I think it's clearly really helpful when they are. I think that slightly, not to give a politician's answer, I think it's slightly the wrong way around, that question. Okay. I think it's not so much should your SENDCO be an SLT. I think it's who should your SENDCO be? Who should you make your SENDCO? So when I was made a SENDCO of a big secondary school in sort of central South London, if I'd been at the same time popped on SLT, it would have been really unhelpful for me, because as well as having this enormous SENDCO role and there's 250 kids on the register and however many kids in the school and all these adults, all these staff to work with, if I'd also been given loads of duties every day, you have to attend all the music concerts, and by the way, can you please also oversee these areas and line manage the geography department, that would have been less helpful. That would have been trickier for me going, I'm struggling with the SENDCO role, let alone everything else that comes with being on the senior leadership.
That is such a good point, because so many people talk about it and say, oh yeah, they should definitely be part of the senior leadership team because they need to be seen in these meetings, they need to be having the oversight. But it's a really good point, if you're putting somebody into the SENDCO role and also into senior leadership team at the same time, it's too big, isn't it? Or potentially too big for them.
So it's not that I think that SENDCO shouldn't be an SLT, don't get me wrong. The question really shouldn't, I think the starting point isn't should your SENDCO be an SLT, the question is, should I have been a SENDCO is maybe the real question.
Don't down that road.
Yeah, thanks. There's often within, safeguarding as an example, and often the two are compared, aren't they? In some ways, rightly, where you have, it might be in a secondary school, it might be the vice principal, in a primary school, it might be the vice principal or the head teacher principal, who is the DSL, but they have, especially in bigger schools, someone doing all the sort of day-to-day follow-up and coordination. But you've got someone really senior in the school making the ultimate calls and ensuring that the school is not just sort of compliant on paper, but is like compliant in the way that compliance is lived and breathed in a school. So if that's the example, then, if that's the sort of comparative, then it might be that in every school, really, you do want someone on SLT to be not just a nominal SENDCO, but to have real strategic vision and leadership of SEND, and to have a qualification as part of that, probably, or be working towards one. But then to have someone who is more like me when I was a bit younger and, a new SENDCO, who is a middle leader, who's still working across the school, still coordinating lots day to day, but ultimately with not just nominal line management of SEND at senior leadership level, but actually real strategic leadership at senior leadership level from someone who is that senior leader. So I think broadly it's helpful. Of course, that SEND needs to be really meaningfully represented at senior level and in meetings, and really not just to sort of turn up every term and go, well, the kids for SEND are doing all right at the moment, but to be mentioning kids with SEND when no one else is, and advocating for those when no one else might be thinking of them. So that's why it's needed at senior level, clearly. But whether that's the SENCO or not is potentially a slightly different question or way of thinking about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you can tell us about your book now. So I'm sure a lot of our listeners and viewers have already read it. It's brilliant. So tell us more about your book, The Lone SENDCO, and why you wrote it, and importantly, why the title.
Thanks. Yeah. So when I first, I mean, there are some absolutely brilliant books out there about being a SENCO, and many that I relied on when I was first a SENCO. One thing I found was that there was quite a lot of sort of blue sky strategic thinking as those kind of books that are like, well, what might your grand strategy for this be? You probably want to consider the factors. And those are great and those are really needed. But also when you're starting as a SENCO, it can be more like, I've got an annual review in 3 weeks' time and I've no idea what one is, let alone what to do, let alone who to email beforehand, let alone what to ask in the meeting, let alone who to follow up with after. So it's actually blue sky thinking, strategic thinking is great. And there are elements of that in the book. But the idea is it's trying to help really busy people who need an answer now to go, okay, here's what I might do. So there's some things in there around what might I do for a child who won't pick up their pen? And okay, well, it could be you need to know the child ultimately and engage the family, but it could be one of these 5 or 6 reasons. So you might do one of these 5 or 6 things. I've got an annual review for a child in early years. Okay, well, you might choose to do it every 6 months rather than every year. You don't have to. It's sort of recommended that you might. I think the wording in the code of practice is you should consider, I think, is the wording. So so things where actually there's lots to read, there's lots of big thinking to do, but help, what do I do now? And even in terms of knowledge of SEND, many SENCOs choose to be a SENCO, and as I've said, others have SENCO-ness sort of thrust upon them. So even do SENCOs all have a good working understanding of what a receptive language need and what we might do about it? And it's okay to acknowledge that many SENCOs who are brand new to being a SENCO and haven't done the qualification yet and haven't had enough time to develop and go on courses and do reading it, they might not know those things. And again, that's totally fine. There are tens of thousands of these people across the country. So yeah, try to create a book that is about going strategic, long-term, blue sky thinking is great, but help, what do I do now? Yeah. Also, it's sort of the Lone SENCO, apart from being a sort of hopefully a bit of a catchy and bit of a silly title, is that idea that if you teach French in a school, you're supported by the head of French who has taught French, is still teaching French, and can support and develop you as a French teacher. Whereas if you're the SENCO, there are many schools when you'll be the only person in that school who's held that post. And so, of course, you can line manage and support colleagues in a role you haven't done yourself, because you can ask the right question, give the right prompt, but you can't sort of necessarily add to their knowledge base and support them with a good tell them sometimes what the good process is to do this, or just know those like warning signs of, hang on, I don't think you thought about that person, that need, that process, etc. So the idea is that there are many schools where there is the SENCO, no one else has held that post, and so a book can't replace all of that. But hopefully, it's a quick reference guide for people who can't get a quick answer unless they go to another SENCO in a neighbouring school who may not have the time to sort of to get back to you quickly.
Yeah, no, and it is brilliant. It's a really good book, and it is the fact that you can just dip in and out of it and find useful information out of it is brilliant. And like you say, there isn't anyone when you're a SENCO who in your school who can support you. You get the role, and then you think somebody else can tell you how to do certain things, how to organise an annual review, how to do all these things, and often nobody knows, and it's quite daunting, isn't it? Whereas your book, you can actually look in it and it tells you what to do without you feeling like a bit silly for asking for help all the time, which I think is really nice, because we don't like to help a lot, do we? And
also on that, if I can add, Regina, often I think SEND feels like it exists on its own, and that children with SEND often exist with a totally sort of separate and individual bits of advice around what we should be doing for them and with them. But actually, often, we can get into sort of children with SEND are aliens and need totally different things territory sometimes. And actually, many children with SEND, their needs are a continuum, and it might be way down a continuum, but it's a continuum that we recognise. And if I said to any colleague in a school, what would you do for a child who's anxious or struggles to read at sort of age typical level, and this is their difficulty, every colleague in the school will be able to say, oh, well, for an anxious, child who's quite anxious in school, I'd think about where they are, who they're next to, how I give feedback, how I communicate with home, the manner in which I offer specific praise, offer reassurance, when you list lots of things. But when a child's on a SEND register, sometimes we think, oh goodness, right, where's the SENDCO's magic wand? Or what have they got a TA with them? Or what are they going to do out of class as an intervention, rather than building that in? And I don't mean to there's no slight on teachers at all. I think it's more a sort of language and approach we sometimes have around supporting children with SEND that's a bit less helpful. So the reason I say that is because I try and touch on the book on some of the evidence around things for all pupils. So things around what does the evidence say around motivation? What does the evidence say around resilience? And it's not all from gathered from evidence base that is pupils with SEND specifically. So it needs a SENDCO to be going, okay, where might that be more or less true for a child with PDA, for example? But actually lots of it will be relevant. And it's for a SENDCO to go, right, okay, so the evidence around resilience says this, the evidence around effective feedback says that. So what does that mean for the feedback I'm giving, what I'm supporting my TAs to do, and what feedback we're giving more widely across the school in relation to, for example, comfort-focused feedback versus strategy-focused feedback, which I think is really relevant to pupils with SEND and how we talk to them very often.
Brilliant. So if we talk about CPD, we're going to have some SENDCOs listening at the moment. There's probably going to be some new SENDCOs, and I imagine some of them are aware that they're going to be leading some CPD soon, and they might not know where to begin. There's so much that perhaps they want to say. They don't know what to share, what to prioritise. They've got a small slot. How would you advise them? Where do you begin when you start planning this CPD?
Okay, so I think there's a few starting points. I'll speak in headlines a little bit, probably. So one-off things don't make a difference would be sort of headline number one. So, and I've definitely done, many of our autistic kids in the school are sort of struggling to be calm, successful, happy, thriving school. So we're going to do an inset on autism in 3 weeks' time, getting someone in, and that will sort of solve that. And again, it's silly because behaviour change is really hard. So I think the example people often give is about smoking's bad for you, but lots of people still smoke. It's not information that's always just needed. It's about behaviour change. So it's not that colleagues won't feel that meeting the needs of autistic kids is important. I've never met a single colleague who didn't want to do a good job for all pupils, but at the same time, how do I build it into my practice? What relevance does it have for my subject or phase? What does that information that I've received in what might be a really good training, how do I filter that down to this individual child? And if as with all SEND, if no two autistic kids are the same, then what does that advice mean for them in particular? So what are the various ways in which CPD can be sort of partly kept alive for momentum's sake, but also given different opportunities for different angles and different people to discuss it in different ways? So that might mean that it does start with a sort of launch, hour-long, everyone's in the hall and we're having a bit of a thing from an external person. But then it's planning the follow-up from before the session even takes place. So that might be, we make sure that, in the next set of department or phase meetings in 2 weeks' time, there's an agenda item and here's 3 sort of reminders of the content that was covered, and here's 3 discussion questions, and here's the one follow-up action that everyone will need to do, and I'll find out in some way. And then it might be, the SENDCO has a surgery where it's about, if that's a surgery specifically about following up that session, come and talk to me on this day or this day about any of these things. And or it might be, in our learning walks or whatever else happens to develop and monitor the quality of teaching and support improvements to the quality of teaching. Then actually, how is the SENDCO involved in that? And or how are other leaders who attended the training and have filtered it and thought about it and thought about what it looks for in class in particular? How is that happening there? And it should never be just the SENDCO either. It's if every head of phase and head of department and or head of department were in that training, then what conversations does the SENDCO have with those middle leaders to go, this training, you lead music or early years or whatever. So what will that mean for what you expect to see in classrooms, and where will teachers be shrugging their shoulders and going, that all makes sense, on paper and it's a good session, but I have no clue what to do with it. So actually supporting leaders across the school to go, I have a role to play in the follow-up if this is going to be impactful.
That's so
I just say, sorry.
I was just going to say, you know what it's like when you've taught a full day and then you go to CPD after school and you sit in the hall and you get your coffee quickly and you've sat down and you just have that one and then you go home. But unless it's followed up, it might be the best CPD in the world and it might be really, really relevant, but you need somebody to tell you how to like make it impact on your lessons and make it impact on the students in your class almost, and how to reflect on it, because otherwise you just come away from it and then you go to the next day and you teach 5 lessons or whatever, and it doesn't get in with what you're actually teaching, does it?
Yeah, and this and thinking about sort of, there can be an attitude to these things from colleagues, totally understandably, which is like, well, it's all right for you, but so if someone has got, a doctorate in autism research and comes and no one at the school knows them and they come and present on this and here's the research and this is what suggests this is useful practice, that's great, but good for you, but I've got 5 lessons tomorrow, is, a very understandable response. And I think similarly for SENDCOs, SENDCOs might not do full classroom teaching or might teach a reduced amount to other colleagues, and they need to, don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But there can be a bit of a, well, they only teach 2 lessons a day and I teach 6, so good for you, you've got the time to do that planning and thought and reading, but I haven't, so good for you. So I think the message there for SENDCOs in particular, I think, is about not underestimating the absolute value in a colleague who teaches, as you may, as a SENDCO, but like hoping you don't, a colleague who teaches 25 lessons a week, if they say, this is what I do, and they're not someone who, they do it because they stay there till midnight, but they do it because they're someone who asks the right questions of their practice, notices the right things, knows their pupils, and manages to work some really good inclusive strategies and approaches into their classroom practice. They're the people we want, that colleagues want to hear from the most, I think, because it's, right, well, you're getting it, there's no reason why you should be able to do it and I shouldn't. You've got the same, essentially the same training and role as me, the same time pressures as me, so therefore if you can do it, I can do it. And also, that person, can we buckle and exemplify what they do by videoing bits of their practice and showing colleagues? It's not just that, I think they call it the knowing and doing gap, I think. So it's like, okay, well, I know you've told me this, but actually, how do I do it? Can you show me what it looks like? So that difference between telling colleagues something and showing them. So the more, I love video exemplification. I could talk for an hour about effective teacher-TA collaborative practices in a classroom, but I could probably show you a 2-minute clip and it would be just as helpful, if not more so, because it's like, all right, well, that's what it can look like. And that's what I think is really, really memorable stuff.
Yeah, and it's not always very easy, especially if you're not given enough time to cover everything if you're doing CPD. What are you finding are the main problems for SENDCOs when they're asked to deliver CPD at the school? Is it time, or is it something else? Or is it this not being able to follow it up?
I think it's I think time is massive, of course, and I think there may be head teachers in the country who are like, yeah, but I give my SENDCO half an hour every half term with all the staff, and it's like sort of misunderstanding at some levels of what those mechanisms of effective CPD are. So if SENDCOs sort of haven't really thought, if you're someone's listening to this going, haven't really thought about whether my CPD has impact or not. I did a survey after and people seem to like it, but actually, does it have impact and change practices? The EEF have got a really good and very accessible sort of bit of they synthesized the best research in this area. And they found, without getting too deep into research with people, they found that effective CPD within education and beyond it achieves 4 things. And so those 4 things, effective CPD builds knowledge. So clearly people need to have a bit more knowledge afterwards than they started with. It develops teaching techniques. So it's not just about knowledge, actually supports teachers to get better over time than what they do. It motivates staff. So we, just because I think it's a good idea, or some research tells you, like if people don't think, I don't just mean they're not bothered. I mean, if people don't think it's worth their effort to make the change that you want them to make, then they won't do it, of course, especially when you leave the room. And then it needs to embed practice over time. So I think it's a really good sort of tick list in SENDCO's own heads at least, of, all right, this thing I want to change. Firstly, have I identified what I want to change and what I want to be different for these pupils or in adult practice? And then if I'm going to make that happen, I need to make sure that I'm building knowledge, I'm developing teaching techniques, I'm motivating staff, and I'm embedding practice over time. And then within that EEF's guidance report, it's called Effective Professional Development. It's just a Google away. It talks about various ways to achieve that across those 4 areas: building knowledge, developing teaching techniques, motivating staff, embedding practice. So that I think is really good for just, if you're thinking I need to develop the quality of teaching in an area of our school where teachers need a bit of help, the pupil cohort is a bit, is complex and need to help. This would be a good sort of mental checklist of how that might happen in
It's really
practice.
helpful. It's always useful to have in your head a checklist as well, isn't it, whenever you're planning anything? So I think that gives you a bit of direction when people who are listening are sort of planning
Yeah,
their CPD. So that's really useful.
agree.
We've spoken about CPD for teachers led by SENDCOs, but what about CPD for SENDCOs themselves? What do you think the areas SENDCOs are perhaps looking to gain more CPD on or need more CPD on? I've said CPD so many times today.
Don't worry. Yeah, we'll talk in
It's become a
acronyms, no
word
problem.
that doesn't feel like a real word anymore.
I think, I mean, again, no two SENCOs the same and lots of things. But really, in answer to your question, I'm thinking, what do people, what don't they teach you? I suppose I'm asking. So
Yeah.
I did my preparation from being you've never been a SENCO on Friday to on Monday you're the SENCO. Like that level of right, here we go. And then so on day one, but also after the SENCO award as well. Actually, what aren't you taught? So for me, there are many things. Sometimes like SEND 101, I just need to upskill myself in terms of the needs of children that we have in the school. So that's like a real thing. But in terms of sort of, I think whole school leadership is a massive thing in relation to SEND. It's the work a lot of the work I do with whole education is around what does effective SEND leadership look like, and how a SENCO could, as I said, could be busy all day every day. But what are those things that are impactful? And I talked before about working through others and working through leaders. So if there is a librarian in the school, for example, who their job is to run the library and provide meaningful access opportunities to engage in reading for pupils across the school. It's not their job to do that for 85% of the school, and then your job as SENCO to do it for 15% of the kids in the SEND register. So I think I've forgotten your question there, Georgina. Sorry.
So
Where do we
there's
start?
the CPD that the SENCOs are looking to gain themselves.
Oh yes, sorry.
I enjoyed your answer. It got me thinking though about what you said about the librarian. It's such a good point that you do almost feel like you're taking responsibility from all subject areas and all areas in school for the children with SEND rather than helping people who have the expertise in that area. Like the librarian will have expertise on which books are the right books and which books children should be reading and etc. And more than that, I'm not giving them justice, but we need to be empowering them more and helping support them with children with SEND rather than taking it away from them and presuming we can be the expert in all areas of the school.
Exactly, and it's not about just barking at people. Every leader's a leader, send off you go. It's about really genuinely supporting them to live and breathe that. But it's about ultimately so they can get better in their leadership role, in their classroom role, in their classroom support role, whatever it is. It's about supporting other colleagues to be better at what they do by bearing those children with SEND in mind in a really meaningful way. So I think, but where I started there, and then got lost on that trail was around leadership and actually SENCOs needing to be thinking of themselves as at the least senior middle leaders, and then making good decisions accordingly. I think around teaching and learning, I know many SENCOs in a sort of slightly more potentially old-fashioned model of, here's my corridor, come with me, and we'll sort of have an arm around the shoulder approach. And all pupils need nurture, all pupils need love and care. So I'm not underestimating any of that. But actually, if I still stand by the most impactful thing we can, the controllable things within a school building is about every teacher making good decisions before and during their lessons and after their lessons, then actually I think it needs SENCOs to be able to talk the language of teaching and learning a bit, and many can, but where some SENCOs can't or don't feel confident as the sort of teaching and learning nut who spends their life reading blogs about teaching and learning and reading Dylan William and quoting Rosenshine. Not every SENCO's explicitly chosen to have that support or been offered that support, and I think that's really really needed there. But of course, hot topics, emotionally based school avoidance are really hot, quite rightly a hot topic, and thing that I think SENCOs, a lot of people are looking to SENCOs on. Meeting complex needs in mainstream settings, I think is we should celebrate parents' right to choose mainstream. We should celebrate the fact that there are complex children in our mainstream schools. But actually, supporting SENCOs to think what's a great, alongside offset pressures and alongside accountability, performance tables, whatever, how can we ultimately just do a really great job for a child whose needs are a bit more complex than a particular school might have been used to?
Yeah, that's really interesting as well that you're saying about, because often when I was writing that question, I thought you'd say like, they should have, like you said about the complex needs. I thought it'd be more like they need to get more understanding of that, or more understanding of emotion-based school avoidance, or more understanding of autistic girls, or they should do that. But actually, it isn't just about SEND that the SENDCOs need CPD on, is it? Like you say, you get a lot of CPD on that, and you get a lot of, you're interested in that, so you'll be finding more out. You might be listening to this podcast, for example, but you're finding out loads of information about SEND, but you're not necessarily being given CPD on leadership skills, on teaching and learning, like you say, all these other things that are part of the role. I found that really interesting. I hadn't thought of it.
And there is a danger of, when we talk about SEND, especially when you describe the twilight that starts at 4 o'clock and people have just managed to grab a coffee or not, there is a danger that when someone stands up and starts talking about SEND, there's a bit of okay. And it's not through any lack of desire for these pupils to do well, but I think it's a starting point of, this is something I don't know about. And that for me is a problem. Whereas if the starting point is effective classroom practice, and teaching and learning within that, that's something that people go, oh, that's my skill set. So talk to me about where SEND sort of fits into the language I talk already. So I like to talk about how, SEND, I think we need to talk the language primarily of teaching and learning, because it's something that people are sort of paid to do and fully invested in and trained and qualified in. And let's start with the language that people already know around effective teaching, and then talk about what differences and nuances and thinking processes need to happen to make sure that that teaching learning they're doing and the core of their job meets those needs, rather than we stand up and talk about visual spatial sketch pads and things that we look at. I just don't know, and I'm glad, SENDCO, that you know, but ultimately I'm really busy. What shall I do tomorrow? So I think in the way we deliver
relate to their practice now, and what they're actually thinking about, what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And I think as well, you don't like it, we have a danger of continuing to sort of make people think SEND is separate. If we have like a separate CPD on SEND and it doesn't feel integrated into what they're doing, then we're sort of continuing that belief that the SEND department is separate to everything else. Do you know what I mean?
Agree, exactly. And it's a real danger, and it just means that the SENDCO's workload is never going to get any better, because there are more pupils with SEND being identified, including those with complex needs, than there were a number of years ago. We know that just from census data, and therefore, for the SENDCO's job to be manageable, for pupils to get truly inclusive experience across their school, we need to be able to offer CPD that people go, okay, I can access this. I can't only do this when the SENDCO's in the room or with enormous support all the time. It needs to start with, I'm a really skilled science teacher or year 3 teacher, whatever. And so this is going to meet me where I am and develop me further, rather than starting in a place where I feel totally lost.
Yeah. Absolutely. And if we talk a little bit about the SEND and AP improvement plan. So I spoke to Claire Coutinho. I know she's no longer sort of in that department anymore. But I spoke to Claire Coutinho last year when the new SEND and AP improvement plan was launched. And one of the big changes, with quite a few changes, but one of the big changes she spoke about was this transition from the NASENCO qualification to replacing it with a new NPQ. And I think that there's been, luckily for you, I think this weekend there was some more information that came out on this, wasn't there? But if we start with the NASENCO, just in case someone who's listening doesn't even know what a NASENCO is, which is perfectly acceptable if they haven't been NASENCO and they haven't looked into the qualifications. Before this NPQ was launched, the NASENCO, what is the qualification and who had to do it? Give us
so more acronyms just there. So the NASENCO award, which I did myself, I did mine at the Institute of Education in London. Has been the statutory qualification for SENDCOs, and still is until the end of this academic year, I suppose. So the statutory qualification to be a SENDCO, people don't need it immediately, but they need to be qualified within 3 years of being appointed as a SENDCO. And that's true for all SENDCOs, I think, who were appointed post 2009. So people are appointed, but after then, to be statutorily compliant, there needs to be a SENDCO with a qualification within 3 years of being appointed. And I think, by the way, we should say clearly there's been a change to SENDCO NPQ. The NASENCO award has been good enough for thousands of SENDCOs across the country for quite a few years. So we should acknowledge this is not a starting point of that was awful and this will all be totally magical and wonderful. It was good enough for many of us and helped us to get to where we are today. there's a strong academic focus in the NASENCO award, and I think that is both, a strength. I think it's either a strength or a problem depending on your mindset a bit. So it carries master's credits. I put it towards my own master's. It really helped me to think about academic study and research, and read lots of journal articles, that kind of thing. I think that the criticism of NASENCO is, does it help you to be a really effective strategic leader of SEND, bring you really closer to evidence around teaching and learning, but wider aspects of leading SEND provision as well? And does it help you to be a leader? So if I sort of merge into a bit of talking about SENDCO NPQ in answer to your question, Georgina, if that's helpful.
It's absolutely fine. I was just thinking the same. You're going to end up talking about the NPQ here, which is fine.
Yeah, thanks. So if that sort of strong academic element was there within the SENDCO award, and really supporting people doing it to be a researcher themselves, well, I think the SENDCO NPQ would argue that it's supporting people to be leaders in schools first and foremost, and maybe elements of research and academic study secondarily, but actually first and foremost, and what people really need, what schools need, what SEND leadership needs, is that real focus on practice and an evidence-informed leadership practice. So people may know that NPQs are sort of split into two. There are leadership NPQs and there are specialist NPQs. And I think many people would expect to see the SENDCO NPQ in specialist, but it's not. And I think that's a really interesting decision that's been made. It's in the leadership NPQ sort of suite. So it's sort of saying, we want to align the training for SENDCOs with other bits of leadership training in schools, but also we don't want it to be thought of as, and there's the SENDCO over there doing their specialist thing. Actually, it's about the coordination and leadership in all elements of the school, with every adult in the school, and with all processes in the school. So there are, 8 strands to it that include things like behaviour, culture, teaching and learning, statutory frameworks. There are bits that are very sort of recognisable as in, here are your statutory duties, you need to know these, but also bits that are about working within behaviour systems that may, and whole school behaviour systems, that may not have featured so heavily, and didn't, in my experience, feature heavily in the NASENCO award.
Yeah. So do you have any big concerns with the NPQ? Are you quite happy with it? Do you think it's a good thing? What's your opinion?
I think the proof's in the pudding.
Yeah.
I think, I'm broadly very positive about it is my answer, and my name's on it, so it would be a bit silly if that is all. So I was engaged as a group of colleagues from across, the sector in sort of helping to form what some of the frameworks, the statements might be. Yeah. I did a bit of work with the EEF in looking at what, how much truth is there in some of those statements. Is there an evidence base to support it? So people might know the EEF play a sort of evidence guardianship role in NPQs. So they are going, all right, there's all these statements that, the providers need to deliver in their course, but actually the EEF is going, well, there's not an evidence base for that. It's just a hunch or just common practice, but there's no evidence base that makes an impact. So the idea is that, people are on these courses are only learning things that have a good evidence base to support them as being truisms, rather than just being fashionable or being fads or being popular. So the proof is in the pudding, of course. And so the initial cohorts, when they begin their study in October, I think a lot will have to be learned from how they find it, whether it's supports practice and has the rigor that we think. But I think the greatest strength is in the sort of supporting, as I mentioned earlier, actually, SENDCOs being leaders, and about strategic leadership and empowering and supporting colleagues across the school around, there's one of the 8 strands is professional development, for example. So and I don't remember that in my SENDCO award. I don't think it was a core aspect of most people. So where SENDCOs might be starting, or sort of being a qualified SENDCO and still not sort of have a really good understanding of effective professional development, one of the strands is the implementation. If we have lots of great ideas and we might send strategies around to staff and say, please do this, click, and actually nothing will change because we haven't implemented that change really well. So one of the 8 strands is around implementation. So there's a lot in it. But I think the greater focus on direct practice is a strength, and hopefully the providers who are going to deliver it are doing some really exciting work now to put those materials together ready for October.
Brilliant. Oh, and before we go, Gary, can you give us your links where people can find your book, where they can find your website, all of that sort of stuff? And I will put those for those people who are listening. If you're listening on your phone or whatever on like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, if you scroll down, you'll be able to see these links. They'll be below. And if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see them down here. So yeah, tell us what you'd like to be linked.
Thanks. Georgina, I wrote that book, The Lone SENDCO, which you can get from John Catt Publishing or from wherever you buy your books. But also my blog is sendmatters.co.uk, and I have some blogs and SENDCO guides and things that hopefully people will find useful. And I'm on Twitter at SendMattersUK. So look forward to connecting with people there, essentially.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Gary. It's been really useful.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Georgina. Thanks for having me.
What a fantastic guest. I feel like I've learned so much about CPD for SENDCOs and about the new NPQ as well. Make sure you have a look at our resources on Twinkle that are linked to this episode. You'll see them in the show notes below, and also the links provided, the link to Gary's book and Gary's website. Make sure you subscribe to our channel as well. Thanks for watching and listening to Send in the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant. See you next time.